The confederation of sentient beings had dominated the galaxy for 3,000 years. They had conquered 17 major civilizations, absorbed 43 minor species, and maintained absolute supremacy through a combination of superior technology, refined military strategy, and an unwavering commitment to warfare as a science. The Quilith, the Vornathi, the Crystalline Collective, and a dozen other apex predator races had unified under the Confederation banner precisely because they recognized that no single species could defeat them in organized combat. Commander Vexthar of the Vornathi stood before the holographic display in the War Council chamber, his 3 eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he reviewed the latest conquest. The human colony on Kepler Station had surrendered within 48 hours of the invasion. Predictable, efficient. The Vornathi had executed the campaign flawlessly, demonstrating once again why the Confederation's military doctrine was unassailable. "The humans pose no threat," announced Director Shen of the Quilith, her crystalline exoskeleton refracting the light from the display screens. "Their technology is primitive. Their strategy is reactive rather than proactive. They lack the genetic predisposition for coordinated warfare that we possess. In fact, I propose we conscript their surviving populations. They would make adequate labor forces, if nothing else." The council chamber erupted in agreement. Species after species expressed their satisfaction. The Confederation had achieved total military mastery. There was no known enemy capable of challenging their supremacy. Some of the younger officers had begun to express concern that warfare itself might become obsolete, that the Confederation had simply won too completely, that there were no more worthy opponents. Admiral Krondak of the Crystalline Collective raised one of his appendages for silence. "We should not be complacent," he said, though his tone suggested he was merely observing protocol. "There is one species we have yet to engage in direct combat: the humans of the Sol system. The ones we have encountered here were colonists, unprepared for military engagement. The core population remains unknown." "Unknown, yes," said Vexthar dismissively, "but we have catalogued their homeworld extensively. Their primary military force numbers in the millions. Their nuclear arsenal, while impressive by their standards, is laughably outdated compared to our quantum cascade weapons. They possess no shields, no faster-than-light combat vessels, no energy weapons of any real consequence. A single Confederation battlecruiser could reduce their entire planet to rubble in an afternoon. I move that we formally declare humanity a conquered species, contingent upon their peaceful surrender to Confederation authority." The vote was unanimous. It was always unanimous. The Confederation had not encountered meaningful resistance in over 400 years. They had refined the art of conquest to such a degree that victory was assumed before hostilities even began. They drafted a message in 73 languages, explaining that humanity's homeworld was now under Confederation control and that resistance would result in the annihilation of their species. They sent the message to Earth on a priority quantum-entangled transmission. They waited for the human response. Dr. James Chen sat in the emergency bunker beneath the Joint Chiefs of Staff headquarters in the Pentagon when the alien message arrived. As humanity's primary xenolinguistic expert, he had been among the first to receive it. He read through the translation once, then again, then a third time, searching for some indication that this was a hoax, some elaborate simulation designed to test the military's readiness protocols. "This is real," the director of the NSA confirmed. We've analyzed the transmission method. It's not anything we can replicate. They have technology centuries beyond ours, maybe more than that. The message originated from 72 light-years away. They're claiming they're already in orbit around our moon. General Patricia Okonkwo, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, stood before the assembled military leadership. "Defensive posture," she commanded. "Launch all satellites equipped with imaging capabilities and point them at lunar orbit. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with. Get me a direct line to every world leader. We need a unified response." "General," said James carefully, "I don't think a military response is viable. Based on their technological assessment of our capabilities in the message, they're not wrong. We have no weapons that can even reach their ships. No systems that can intercept their weapons if they decided to attack. They've declared us conquered. If we attack, we're essentially committing species suicide." "And if we surrender?" demanded General Marcus Webb, Joint Chief of Naval Operations. "We haven't survived this long as a species by capitulating to tyrants." "They're not tyrants," James said quietly. "Not yet, anyway. They're confident. They believe they've won without firing a shot. That gives us negotiation room. But if we attack, if we demonstrate that we're no longer willing to accept their terms, they won't have any reason to hold back. They'll respond with overwhelming force. We can't win a military engagement with them. That's not defeatism. That's mathematics." General Okonkwo studied him carefully. "Then what do you suggest, Dr. Chen?" "I suggest we talk to them," James said. "We send a delegation. We learn their terms. We negotiate from a position of understanding rather than ignorance. And most importantly, we buy time. Time for us to understand their capabilities better. Time to establish whether they're amenable to coexistence or if they genuinely intend to subjugate us." The general considered this. Outside the bunker, alarms were sounding throughout the Pentagon. Military forces were mobilizing. Fighter jets were being readied. Every nation on Earth was entering a state of alert. This was the moment humanity had feared since first receiving radio signals from the stars. Invasion. First contact not as equals, but as the conquered facing the conqueror. "Put together a delegation," General Okonkwo commanded. "Military attachés, diplomats, scientists. And Dr. Chen, you'll lead the diplomatic effort. You have 24 hours to prepare. After that, we meet the aliens on their terms and negotiate for humanity's survival." James Chen had never imagined he would die in orbit, which is what he expected would happen when his shuttle launched from the Kennedy Space Center. The facility had been hastily secured and militarized, but the launch itself had the eerie quality of a funeral procession. Hundreds of thousands of people had gathered, despite government warnings, standing in the Florida heat to watch humanity's representative journey toward the unknown. The delegation consisted of 12 people. James served as the chief diplomat, his expertise in linguistic translation and xenology making him indispensable. General Rebecca Torres would handle military matters, along with a small team of strategic advisors. Dr. Amara Okafor represented the scientific community and would handle discussions regarding knowledge exchange. Secretary of State Margaret Pierce would manage the political negotiations. A small security detail rounded out the group. The shuttle cut through Earth's atmosphere, and James watched through the window as the planet fell away beneath them. For a moment, he felt utterly alone, separated not just from Earth, but from everything familiar. Then the Confederation vessel appeared on the instruments. It was impossibly large. The descriptors that came back from their sensors seemed inadequate. A ship so vast that the moon looked small beside it. Sleek, black as the void itself, covered in ports and protrusions that spoke to capabilities humans could barely conceptualize. This was what humanity would be fighting against if it came to combat. This was the futility made manifest in metal and energy. The shuttle docked with a gentleness that surprised James. He had half expected some display of alien aggression or disdain, but the docking procedure was smooth, almost courteous. The airlock cycled. The interior doors opened. The alien who greeted them was humanoid, which was perhaps the most unsettling thing about the encounter. It wasn't human, not even close. Its skin was a deep purple gray. Its eyes were positioned slightly differently than human eyes, its proportions just slightly off. But it had 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a face. It was as though the universe had tried to create a human being and nearly succeeded, but decided to make just enough variations to make the result deeply, viscerally wrong. I am Translator 3rd Velcadrin of the Quileth species, the creature said in English, though James could hear the translation algorithm working around the edges of the words. I have been assigned to facilitate your communication with the Confederation War Council. Welcome to the subjugation vessel Inevitable Dominion. The War Council will see you momentarily. Please follow me. They walked through corridors that seemed designed to impress and intimidate. Everything was immense, constructed on a scale that made humans look like insects. The walls were transparent in places, revealing vast engine rooms, weapon systems, storage bays. This wasn't a military vessel designed by a species that had recently achieved spaceflight. This was the product of centuries, perhaps millennia, of technological refinement. This was a machine of conquest, built by species that had spent eons perfecting the art of war. The War Council chamber was a circular room at the heart of the ship. Transparent panels revealed the stars beyond, and in the center, suspended by some invisible support system, was a holographic representation of the Confederation's known territory. It was enormous. Thousands of stars, thousands of worlds. Humanity's entire sphere of influence, the mighty expanse of space that humans had worked so hard to explore and colonize, was nothing but a tiny sliver of the Confederation's domain. A grain of sand on a vast beach. Arrayed around the chamber were representatives of the Confederation species. Some were vaguely humanoid, like Velcadrin. Others were wildly alien. Crystalline beings of impossible geometry, insectoid creatures with too many limbs, something that looked like a mobile collection of tentacles. They all possessed one thing in common, the bearing of a species that had never known defeat, the absolute confidence of the master facing the conquered. Commander Vexthar took the lead. His 3 eyes focused on the human delegation with what might have been amusement. Dr. James Chen, he said, reading from some unseen source, lead diplomat of the human species. You come before the Confederation War Council as representatives of a newly conquered civilization. I trust you understand the nature of this meeting. You are here to discuss the terms of your species' integration into Confederation authority. There will be no negotiation regarding your status as a subject species. There may be some discussion regarding the scope and nature of your conscription into Confederation military forces and labor programs. You have presented no resistance beyond a handful of communications we have assessed as rudimentary attempts at defiance. This is commendable. Resistance would have been futile and would have resulted in your complete annihilation. Instead, we offer you the opportunity to serve the Confederation and, in so doing, to benefit from our technological advancement and cultural superiority. Do you have any questions before we proceed to the terms of surrender? James took a breath. This was the moment that would define humanity's future, the fulcrum upon which the species' fate balanced. He thought of Earth below, of billions of people who had no idea that their destiny was being decided in this chamber. He thought of every human who had ever lived, all of them pointing toward this singular moment in time. "Yes," James said carefully. "I have a question." "Speak," commanded Vexthar. "Before we discuss terms, I wonder if you would be willing to send a delegation to Earth," James said. "Not as conquerors, but as guests, as representatives of the Confederation. I would like to introduce you to humanity, our culture, our art, our science. We may be primitive by your standards, but we have value. I believe that understanding us as more than merely a conquered species might benefit any long-term relationship between our peoples." There was a moment of silence in the chamber. James could sense the skepticism radiating from the assembled aliens. Director Shen's crystalline form shifted, as though she was conferring with others at a frequency humans couldn't perceive. "The human makes a reasonable point," admitted Admiral Krondak. "We have limited data on human psychology. A brief cultural exchange might prove instructive, and it would reinforce that the Confederation is magnanimous in victory. It sends a message to other species regarding what awaits them if they accept our authority without resistance." After further discussion, the War Council agreed. Velkadrin would lead a small delegation to Earth. They would spend 72 hours observing human civilization, and then they would return to finalize the terms of surrender. It was not a victory exactly, but it was a reprieve. It was time. And James Chen had absolutely no idea what he would do with it. The delegation arrived via shuttle to a military base in Nevada. The human government had requested the location be kept secret, fearing that if the location became known to the general population, chaos would ensue. The Confederation had agreed, amused by what they perceived as humanity's quaint concern for public order. Velkadrin and his team of 5 other alien observers found themselves in a secure facility, watching carefully curated presentations of human civilization. They were shown military capabilities. They observed demonstrations of human athletics, culture, and technology. They were given access to human media, literature, and historical records. Everything was designed to show humanity in the best possible light, while confirming the Confederation's assessment that they were a primitive species deserving of subjugation. But then, on the second day of their visit, something unexpected happened. Velkadrin requested permission to visit a hospital, specifically a military hospital where wounded soldiers recovering from combat injuries were receiving treatment. The human handlers were uncertain about this request, but there seemed no strategic harm in it. The delegation was escorted to the facility, where they observed human doctors treating injuries, performing surgery, and facilitating recovery. Velkadrin spent hours there, asking questions through the translation system, examining the techniques and medicines employed by human practitioners. When they left the hospital, Velkadrin was quiet. His translator algorithms seemed to be working in overdrive as he processed what he had witnessed. "You employ complex biological intervention to treat injuries your species could easily prevent through better tactical doctrine," Velkadrin said finally. "We do what we can with the resources we have," replied Dr. Amara Okafor, who was accompanying the delegation. "Our medical technology has advanced significantly in recent centuries. We've developed treatments for many conditions that would have been terminal in our past." "And yet you accept casualties," Velkadrin continued. "You treat them. You attempt to restore them to functionality. This represents a significant expenditure of resources for limited return on investment.
It's not about return on investment, Dr. Okafor said carefully. It's about valuing individual lives. Each of these soldiers is a person. They have families. They have futures. Treating them isn't just military strategy, it's a moral imperative.
Velkodrin seemed to process this for a long moment. "Fascinating," he said finally. "Your species' approach to warfare is remarkably inefficient from a strategic perspective." But something had changed in his tone. If James didn't know better, he would have said the aliens sounded thoughtful. The final request came on the evening of the second day. Velkodrin asked to visit a place of civil gathering, a concert. The humans had decided to show their visitors what human culture truly was at its core, and what better way than to demonstrate humanity at play, at celebration. The concert was a carefully selected performance of classical music at the Los Angeles Philharmonic. The delegation sat in a private box, watching as an orchestra of humans played music that had been composed centuries ago by human artists now long dead. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy. As the music swelled, James watched Velkodrin carefully. The alien's form was still, but something in his bearing suggested that he was not merely observing, he was experiencing. The translator systems that accompanied the delegation began providing technical information about the music, frequency analysis, the mathematical precision of the composition, but Velkodrin seemed less interested in the data and more interested in simply absorbing the experience. When the symphony concluded and the audience erupted in applause, James saw something remarkable. Velkodrin attempted to applaud as well, mimicking the human gesture with his alien hands. It was crude, imperfect, but the gesture was unmistakable. After the performance, Velkodrin requested a private meeting with James. They sat in a quiet conference room, away from the other observers. "Your species is remarkable," Velkodrin said without preamble. "Not despite your primitiveness, but in some ways because of it. You invest resources into activities that serve no practical military purpose. You compose music, you create art, you treat your wounded even when it provides no tactical advantage. You value individual lives. From a Confederation perspective, these are inefficiencies, weaknesses. And yet, prompted James. And yet, there is something here that I have not encountered in 3,000 years of service to the Confederation, Velkodrin said. A kind of resilience that does not come from superior technology or refined strategy. You are fragile. Your bodies are weak. Your weapons are primitive. Your medical technology is archaic. And yet, you persist. You create meaning in a meaningless universe. You find joy in things that have no tactical value. I do not understand it, and that is refreshing." James chose his words carefully. "Will you recommend to the War Council that they reconsider their decision to conquer us?" "No," Velkodrin said immediately. "The War Council would not listen. And more importantly, conquest is our nature. It is what we are. The Confederation exists because we are superior. Your species is inferior, militarily, technologically, strategically. There is no shame in being conquered. There is only the inevitable outcome of conflict between species of vastly different capabilities. And yet," he paused, "there is a difference between conquest and destruction. Between subjugation and annihilation. The War Council intends to incorporate you into the Confederation. You will serve. You will labor. You will contribute to the glory of our civilization. But you will not be extinguished. Not immediately. Perhaps in 1,000 years, your species will be so fully integrated into the Confederation that the concept of human will be meaningless. But that is far enough in the future to be of no consequence to you personally. It was, James realized, the closest thing to mercy the Confederation was capable of offering. The War Council convened once more to receive the report of Velkadrin's delegation. The alien translator laid out his findings in clinical, strategic terms. Humanity possessed no military capability of significance. Their technology was primitive. Their strategy was reactive and inefficient. Their population was malleable and could be easily integrated into Confederation systems. There were no surprises. Humanity was as conquered as the War Council had predicted. And yet, Velkadrin concluded, I recommend a modification to the terms of conquest. Vexthar's 3 eyes focused on the translator. Explain. The human species possesses qualities that, while not strategically relevant, may provide value from a cultural perspective, Velkadrin said. They create art. They compose music. They write literature. These outputs serve no military purpose and consume resources that could be dedicated to warfare, and yet they persist in creating them. It suggests a psychological resilience that might prove useful in understanding conquered species that similarly prioritize cultural output over military efficiency. I propose that instead of full conscription into labor and military forces, we allow a small percentage of the human population to continue their cultural pursuits. We would study them, we would learn from them, and in doing so, we might better understand how to manage other conquered species that share similar characteristics. This is inefficiency, stated Director Shen flatly. These humans should be working for the Confederation. Art has no value. Music serves no purpose. On the contrary, replied Velkadrin, understanding our conquered species has immense value. It allows us to manage them more effectively, to predict their responses, to prevent rebellions before they occur. I am suggesting an investment in knowledge, not an abandonment of conquest. The humans will still be subject to Confederation authority. They will still be inferior. But we will allow them a period of cultural flourishing while we observe and study them. It will cost us minimal resources and will yield maximum intelligence regarding species psychology. The War Council debated for hours. Some agreed with Velkadrin. Others, particularly Shen and Vexthar, argued that any allowance for human cultural output was a waste of resources. In the end, a compromise was reached. Humanity would be allowed a 50-year period of limited cultural autonomy, during which humans would be permitted to continue their artistic and literary pursuits. After that time, a re-evaluation would occur, and if the cultural output proved to have no value, the Confederation would conscript the human population for military and labor purposes. It was a half measure, a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but that everyone could accept. The terms of surrender were presented to Earth's leadership. Humanity would be incorporated into the Confederation as a subject species. Military forces would be disbanded. Technology would be surrendered. Humans would receive Confederation citizenship, which meant they could travel to Confederation worlds and would be protected by Confederation law. In exchange, they would accept the authority of the Confederation and would contribute to the collective advancement of the Confederation civilization. The war that had never begun was over. Humanity had lost without firing a shot. And somehow, inexplicably, they had won a reprieve. General Okonkwo presented the terms to world leaders. There was significant debate. Some argued that humanity should fight, that surrender was unacceptable regardless of the odds.
But Dr. Chen was blunt with the military leadership. Resistance would result in extinction. Surrender meant survival, at least for now. In the end, the argument for survival won out. The Treaty of Subordination was signed by representatives of every nation on Earth. Humanity became a confederation species. For 15 years, humanity lived under Confederation rule. It was not oppression, exactly. The Confederation had made good on its promise. Humans had access to Confederation technology. Diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia were cured. The energy crisis was solved. Famine became impossible. Lifespan increased dramatically. By any objective measure, humanity's material conditions improved exponentially. And yet, something was being lost. A kind of spirit, a certain vitality. The conscription programs were mandatory. Every human citizen was required to serve 5 years in Confederation military or labor forces. Many were assigned to research facilities, where human creativity was prized for its unusual problem-solving approaches. But most were assigned to simple labor, mining, manufacturing, agricultural production on colony worlds. The work was not torture, not by Confederation standards, but it was endless. Cycle after cycle of service, generation after generation. James Chen, now in his 50s, watched this slow erosion of human spirit from his position as cultural advisor to the Confederation Council. He had been granted an unusual position of influence, allowed to speak directly to Confederation leadership regarding human interests. It was a remarkable achievement for a human, and it pained him every single day. He would argue for longer periods of cultural freedom. He would advocate for reduced conscription periods. He would request resources for human education and development. And occasionally, he would win small victories. An extra year of freedom, a cultural grant, the right to establish universities where human culture could be preserved and studied. But the fundamental trajectory was clear. The Confederation was slowly but inexorably erasing what made humanity unique. Not through cruelty, but through assimilation, through integration, through the simple, gentle process of making humans into just another species in the galactic collective, indistinguishable from 1,000 others. James had a son, David, born 15 years after the conquest. David had never lived in an independent human civilization. The Confederation was the only authority David had ever known. He served his 5-year conscription period willingly, having been trained from birth to accept Confederation authority as natural and inevitable. He had no sense of what it meant to be human in the way that James understood it. He was simply another citizen of the Confederation, no different from a Quillith or a Vornathi, except in his genetic code. It was this realization that drove James to do something he had never done before. He violated the confidence of the Confederation. He sent a message to every human on Confederation worlds. A video, a final testament. In it, he spoke of what it meant to be human. He spoke of earth and sky. He spoke of love and loss. He spoke of art and music and literature. He spoke of the fragile beauty of human civilization and how it was being erased, not through conquest, but through the slow assimilation of a species that had learned too well how to surrender. "Do not forget what you are," he told the camera, speaking to his own species across the gulf of worlds and stars. The Confederation tells us that military strength and technological capability are what matter. They tell us that our art is inefficient, that our music serves no purpose, that our love for one another is a weakness. Do not believe them. What makes us human is not what we achieve through violence or domination. It is what we create despite our limitations. It is what we preserve even when it seems futile. It is what we maintain in our hearts when the universe tries to make us into something less. Remember, please remember what you are.
The message was intercepted by Confederation authorities immediately. James was arrested within hours. An investigation was launched. There was debate about whether he should be terminated or rehabilitated or simply held indefinitely.
In the end, it was Velkudrin who spoke in his defense. The alien translator argued that punishing James would only confirm that the Confederation was threatened by human cultural output, which would undermine the entire purpose of the cultural preservation program. Instead, Velkudrin argued that James should be allowed to continue his work, that he represented exactly the kind of inefficient but valuable cultural perspective that the Confederation had agreed to study.
James was released with a warning. His freedom was conditional. His communications were monitored. His influence was limited. But he survived, and more importantly, he remained a voice for human identity within the Confederation structure.
20 years after the conquest, a rebellion began. It wasn't organized by military leaders or political figures. It emerged organically from the human population, driven by young people who had never known independence, but who somehow, despite all efforts at integration, had preserved some essential core of what made them human.
They called themselves the Resistance, though they engaged in no violence. Instead, they created art. They wrote literature that celebrated human struggles and human dreams. They composed music that stirred something in the human heart, something that Confederation-approved compositions could never quite touch. They told stories of Earth. They preserved human history. They created spaces where humans could speak to one another in human languages about human concerns.
In the end, they were unable to suppress it effectively. For every piece of art they confiscated, 10 more were created. For every artist they arrested, 100 more took up the work. The resistance grew not because it was organized, but because it was inevitable. Because humans, despite their genetic inferiority to the Confederation species, possessed something that Confederation species did not. Something that could not be conquered through military superiority or technological advancement. They possessed meaning. It was in the 45th year after the conquest that everything changed. And the change came not from the Confederation, it came from within humanity itself.
His name was Marcus Halsey, and he was one of billions of humans living under Confederation rule. He was nothing special, physically inferior to any Confederation soldier, intellectually competent but not exceptional, psychologically unremarkable. He was a laborer assigned to a Confederation research facility on the colony world of Prometheus 7, working in manufacturing plants that produced components for Confederation weapon systems. By all accounts, Marcus Halsey was exactly the kind of human that the Confederation valued. Compliant, productive, content with his role in the Galactic Collective. He had completed his mandatory service years and continued to work at the facility on a voluntary basis, choosing stability over the uncertainty of independent life.
And then Marcus Halsey's daughter was diagnosed with a terminal genetic disease.
The disease, called Tharos syndrome, was a condition that occurred in approximately 1 in a million humans. It was caused by a genetic sequence that was harmless in most populations, but fatal when expressed in certain human genotypes. The Confederation had sophisticated medical technology that could treat almost any condition. But Tharos syndrome was deemed too rare to warrant research. There were too few humans affected. The cost-benefit analysis did not justify the expenditure of resources. Marcus's daughter, 7-year-old Emma, would die within 6 months without intervention. The Confederation doctors were very clear about this. They were sympathetic in their way. They offered to provide comfort care. They suggested that perhaps Marcus and his wife should consider having additional children, as the Confederation had excellent programs for reproductive management. This was the moment that changed everything. Marcus Halsey requested an audience with James Chen, whose reputation as a human advocate had spread throughout the Confederation's human population. James, now in his 70s, still maintained his position as a cultural advisor.
He had been allowed to establish a small university dedicated to human studies, one of the few places in the galaxy where humans could learn about their own species' history and culture.
They met in James's office at the university. Marcus sat across from the old man with his daughter's medical records displayed on a tablet between them.
"The Confederation has the medical technology to save her," Marcus said. "I know they do. I've seen their medical systems. I've read technical documentation. They can cure this. But they won't, because the cost-benefit analysis says she's not worth it. She's one human among billions. Her death means nothing to them, and I'm powerless to save her."
James read the records carefully. The disease was treatable. Marcus was right about that. The Confederation certainly possessed the technology to cure it. But the Confederation's strategic calculus had no room for the value of a single life. From their perspective, allowing one human child to die was perfectly acceptable if it meant directing resources toward military advancement or conquest of new territories.
"What do you want me to do?" James asked quietly. "I want you to help me force them to save her," Marcus said. "I want you to use your influence. I want you to make them understand that this matters, that my daughter matters."
James considered this carefully. He had spent 45 years trying to work within the Confederation system, to advocate for human rights through the proper channels, to effect change through diplomacy and gentle persuasion. It had accomplished very little. The fundamental truth remained: humanity was subordinate. Human lives were expendable from the Confederation's perspective. "I can try," James said finally, "but I don't think it will work. The Confederation doesn't respond to moral arguments. They respond to strategic calculations. If you want them to save your daughter, you need to make it strategically advantageous for them to do so." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then help me do that," he said. James presented the case for curing Theros syndrome to the Confederation War Council. It was a logical argument, framed in terms that the Confederation could understand. Humans possessed certain neurological characteristics that made them valuable for creative problem-solving. Humans had demonstrated capacity for artistic and cultural output. Humans had proven capable of maintaining coherence and identity even under complete subordination. These were valuable assets. To randomly allow valuable assets to degrade through preventable disease was inefficient. Moreover, James argued, failure to preserve valuable human lives would undermine the cultural preservation program. It would give humans reason to believe that the Confederation's stated interest in human culture was merely a facade concealing genocidal intent. This could potentially threaten the stability of human Confederation relations. Director Shen listened to the argument impassively. When James finished, she was silent for a long moment. "You are arguing that we should expend resources to preserve an individual human life based on the strategic value of human Confederation relations," she said finally. "Yes," replied James. "But the human population numbers in the billions," Shen continued. "The loss of a single human would have negligible impact on the overall value of the human asset class." "True," acknowledged James, "but the impact on human psychology would be significant. Humans process information through emotional frameworks in a way that Confederation species do not. When they learn that the Confederation allowed a child to die despite possessing the ability to save her, they will reach conclusions about Confederation intentions that will resonate far beyond the death of a single individual." There was more debate, but ultimately the argument proved persuasive. The Confederation agreed to develop a cure for Theros syndrome. Resources were dedicated to the project. Within 2 months, a treatment protocol had been developed. Emma Halsey was cured. To James, this seemed like a victory, small but real. He had proven that humans could advocate for their own interests within the Confederation system, that logical argument could produce results. He reported his success to Marcus with genuine satisfaction. "You saved my daughter," Marcus said when they met to discuss the outcome. "Thank you." But something in Marcus's expression troubled James. The man didn't seem grateful. He seemed contemplative, almost sad. "What's wrong?" James asked. "Nothing," Marcus replied. "You saved her. You proved that we can get what we need from the Confederation if we make the right arguments. But that's the problem, isn't it? We can only save our people if we can convince them that we're valuable enough to be worth saving. We live on their sufferance, at their discretion. Today, they decided that my daughter's life had strategic value. Tomorrow, they might decide otherwise. We're not people to them, we're assets." Valuable assets? Maybe, but assets nonetheless. And that will never change as long as we accept their authority. "What are you suggesting?" asked James, though he thought he already knew. "I'm suggesting that we stop accepting it," Marcus said quietly. "I'm suggesting that we fight." James felt something cold settle in his chest. "Marcus, we can't win. We tried that. Humanity tried resistance when the Confederation first arrived. It didn't work. It can't work." "Maybe not militarily," conceded Marcus, "but there are other ways to fight, and I think you know that better than anyone. I think that's what you've been advocating for all along. Not military victory, but cultural resistance, identity, the refusal to be absorbed, the insistence on being human despite everything the Confederation can do to make us something else." "That's not fighting," said James. "That's survival." "No," corrected Marcus. "Fighting is what we do when we resist, when we refuse, when we insist on being more than what they want us to be. And that's worth doing, even if we lose. Especially if we lose. Because losing while standing up is better than winning by surrendering everything that makes us worth being in the first place." What began with Marcus Halsey and one family's determination to preserve their daughter's life evolved into something far larger. The story spread through human networks. A child was dying. The Confederation had the ability to save her. And through the intervention of human advocates, the Confederation agreed to do so. It wasn't a revolutionary narrative by any means, but it resonated because it contains something essential: hope. If one human life could be preserved through argument and advocacy, perhaps other humans could be saved in the same way. Perhaps human agency mattered in the Confederation system, even if only marginally. Perhaps humanity wasn't entirely powerless. The resistance grew, but it changed character. It was no longer simply about creating art and preserving culture. It became a movement dedicated to asserting human value and demanding recognition of human rights. Demonstrations were organized on Confederation worlds. Humans refused to work in conscription programs. Strikes were called. Peaceful protests erupted in coordinated action across dozens of human settlements. The Confederation was baffled. This wasn't military resistance. It was something far more insidious from their perspective. It was organized refusal to accept subordination. It was the assertion of human dignity in a universe where the hierarchy of power suggested that humans had no dignity to assert. In response, the Confederation sent military forces to suppress the protests. But they were careful. James had warned them, correctly, that using overwhelming military force to suppress peaceful human gatherings would undermine their stated position that they valued human culture. So instead, they employed selective arrests. They identified resistance leaders and detained them. They tried to decapitate the movement by removing its head. It didn't work. For every leader arrested, 2 more emerged. The movement was not hierarchical, it was distributed. It was rooted in the fundamental human desire to resist subjugation, and that desire could not be arrested or suppressed through conventional means. And then, 6 months into the sustained resistance movement, something happened that changed everything. Marcus Halsey was arrested during a demonstration on the colony world of New Jakarta. He was detained without trial, held in a Confederation security facility. The charges were vague: incitement to rebellion, seditious communication, violation of subordination protocols. The Confederation intended to make an example of him, to demonstrate that even peaceful resistance had consequences, to show that the Confederation's tolerance had limits. They underestimated what Marcus Halsey had become to the resistance. He wasn't a leader in any formal sense. He didn't have a position or authority, but he had become a symbol. He was the man who had saved his daughter. He was proof that human resistance was possible. He was a living embodiment of the argument that human lives mattered. When the Confederation announced that Marcus Halsey would be executed, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The execution was to be carried out in the amphitheater of New Jakarta's primary detention facility. It was a symbolic location, chosen deliberately to demonstrate the Confederation's authority in the heart of human civilization. What happened instead was unprecedented. When the Confederation brought Marcus Halsey out for execution, they discovered that thousands of humans had gathered outside the detention facility. Not to stage a rescue. They had no weapons. They had no way to actually prevent the execution. They had simply come to witness it, to stand as testimony to what was happening, to refuse to let his death be invisible, buried in administrative records and forgotten. The Confederation considered dispersing them with force, but the humans had carefully positioned themselves in a way that made force dangerous. They were tightly packed, vulnerable to crowd stampedes if the Confederation soldiers fired on them. If they killed these humans to maintain order, it would create new martyrs, new symbols of Confederation brutality. If they allowed the gathering to proceed, it would demonstrate that humans could defy orders without suffering consequence. The decision was made to proceed with the execution as planned, trusting that the show of force and authority would eventually convince the gathered humans to disperse. They brought Marcus Halsey to the execution platform. The Confederation had chosen death by disintegration as the method, thinking to make it quick and efficient. But before the procedure could be carried out, Marcus did something unexpected. He began to sing. It was a human song, old and simple. The words were in English, a language that most of the gathered humans understood. A song about standing firm, about not giving in, about the courage of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. It was a song that had been sung by humans throughout their history in moments of defiance. And as Marcus sang, the thousands of humans gathered outside began to sing with him. Their voices rose in unison, a counterpoint to the sounds of the Confederation military machinery. Not a weapon, not a physical force, but something that seemed to affect the gathered aliens in a way that violence never could. The Confederation soldiers looked uncertain. They had been trained to deal with armed resistance. They had protocols for neutralizing military threats. But this was something else. This was meaning. This was identity. This was humans refusing to be anything other than human, even in the face of death. And then something remarkable happened. The human voice carries certain frequencies that have resonance in the biology of certain species. The song that Marcus and the gathered humans sang triggered acoustic responses in the neural tissue of nearby Vornathi soldiers. The high notes caused mild pain. Nothing debilitating, but noticeable enough that the soldiers began to shift uncomfortably. More importantly, the song triggered emotional responses in the neural systems of all listeners. Humans responded with feelings of unity and strength. Confederation species responded with something like admiration, respect. For an instant, in that moment, the species standing before each other seemed slightly less divided.
Marcus Halsey reached the moment of his execution. He continued to sing, his voice unwavering. The human voices outside the amphitheater continued, rising and falling like an ocean. The Confederation soldiers stood frozen, uncertain of their orders. And then, from the crowd, one voice emerged. It was Velkodrin, the Quillith translator who had first witnessed human culture during the early years of Confederation rule. His voice was not human, but he was attempting to replicate the melody, to join in the singing, despite his alien physiology making it nearly impossible. He was joined by others, Confederation soldiers and officers who had worked with humans for decades, who had learned to appreciate something beyond the calculus of military strategy and conquest, who understood, perhaps for the first time, what Velkodrin had seen all those years ago. They were singing a human song, not because they were conquered by it, but because in that moment something transcended the hierarchy of power and military dominance. In that moment, Marcus Halsey was not a subordinate species. He was not a conquered being waiting for execution. He was a human, singing a song of courage and defiance, and that made him equal to anyone in the galaxy. The execution was not carried out. The War Council was in complete disarray. For the first time in their institutional history, they faced a situation that their military doctrine and strategic planning could not comprehend. Humans possessed no military capability to speak of. They had no weapons, no ships, no technology. And yet they had somehow defeated a military operation through the simple act of singing. The council debated for hours what should happen next. Should they execute Marcus anyway to reassert authority? But doing so would only create a martyr and potentially trigger a species-wide rebellion that even the Confederation couldn't suppress with conventional force. Should they release him? But that would appear to be surrender. In the end, it was Velkodrin who proposed a solution. "We have been approaching this problem incorrectly," he stated to the council. "We have assumed that military and strategic dominance represents mastery of war. But what we have witnessed today suggests a more fundamental truth. We are masterful at coordinating violence. We are supreme at the logistics of conquest. But we are not masterful at war itself." "Explain," commanded Vexthar, his tone dangerous. "War is not merely the application of force," Velkodrin continued. "War is the imposition of will through resistance. We have achieved total military dominance, but we have not achieved mastery of war, because we have not learned how to win when the opponent refuses to fight on our terms. We have not learned how to conquer the human spirit. We have crushed every military force that has ever opposed us. But humans have proven that they can resist us through non-military means, through culture, through identity, through meaning. These are things that our weapons cannot destroy." "You are suggesting that we have not conquered humanity?" asked Director Shen coldly. "I am suggesting that we have not mastered war," replied Velkodrin. "We have conquered territory and population, yes, but humanity has demonstrated that these victories are incomplete. As long as humans remain human, they retain the ability to resist us at a level that our military might cannot reach. This is a new form of warfare, a warfare of identity and meaning rather than force and strategy. If we wish to truly master war, we must learn to fight this kind of warfare. And I do not believe we are currently capable of doing so." The implications hung in the air. The Confederation had spent 3,000 years perfecting the science of military conquest. They had refined their doctrine to an art form, And they had suddenly discovered that they were facing an opponent whose strength lay precisely in the areas where the Confederation's doctrine was weakest. A human could be conscripted, forced into service, but they could not be made to stop being human. A human could be imprisoned, detained, threatened, but they would continue to create art, to compose music, to find meaning in a meaningless universe. A human could be defeated over and over again, and they would continue to stand up and sing.
"What do you recommend?" asked Vexthar finally.
"I recommend a fundamental re-evaluation of Confederation policy regarding humanity," Velkodrin said carefully. "I recommend that we negotiate with humanity as equals rather than as a conquered species. I recommend that we establish formal human representation in Confederation governmental structures. I recommend that we cease conscription programs and allow humans to contribute to the Confederation on a voluntary basis. I recommend that we support human cultural development rather than suppress it. Because if we do not, I predict that human resistance will eventually inspire similar movements in other subject species. And this new form of warfare will spread until it threatens the stability of the entire Confederation." The War Council debated this proposal at length. Some wanted to implement it. Others argued that it represented unacceptable surrender to a species that was militarily inferior. But Velkodrin had planted a seed of doubt in the Confederation's collective mind. They had mastered war through force, but they did not know how to master this. In the end, a compromise was reached. Marcus Halsey would be released. A formal inquiry would be established to evaluate human Confederation relations. New protocols would be developed to respect human cultural autonomy. The conscription program would be modified to allow humans to opt out of military service in exchange for other forms of contribution to the Confederation. It was not a full reversal of Confederation policy, but it was significant, and it represented something that had never happened before in Confederation history, a step backward from complete dominance, taken not because of military pressure, but because of something far more subtle and dangerous. Humanity had taught the Confederation that there was a form of warfare that their weapons could not defeat. 20 years after Marcus Halsey's execution was prevented, humanity had transformed its relationship with the Confederation in ways that seemed impossible before. Humans served in Confederation governmental structures. Human cultural output became celebrated rather than suppressed. Universities dedicated to human studies proliferated across Confederation worlds. Human art and music began to be appreciated not merely as curiosities, but as valid expressions of value and meaning. More importantly, the resistance movement that had inspired this change did not fade away. Instead, it evolved. It became formalized into political structures. It became organized advocacy for human rights. And most critically, it became a model that other subject species began to adopt. Within a decade, the Crystalline Collective was raising questions about why their aesthetic sensibilities were being suppressed. The Vornathi were asking why their warrior traditions were being erased in favor of pure Confederation doctrine. Other species began to reassert their identity, their culture, their fundamental nature as something that was valuable and should be preserved. The Confederation was not destroyed by this movement. It did not collapse or fracture, but it was fundamentally altered. It transformed from a rigid hierarchy based on military dominance into something far more complex. A genuine civilization composed of multiple species, each contributing its unique perspective and culture. It was far less efficient than it had been. Resources were spent on cultural preservation that could have been dedicated to military advancement. Governance became complicated by the need to negotiate between species rather than simply imposing decisions from above. And yet, the Confederation discovered that this new structure was stronger than the old one had ever been. Species that were no longer being forcibly assimilated remained stable and content. The constant low-level rebellion that had characterized human Confederation relations gradually diminished. A genuine sense of community began to develop, based not on subordination, but on mutual interest. James Chen, now in his 90s, was invited to speak before the Confederation General Assembly on the 50th anniversary of Marcus Halsey's defiance. He stood before the assembled representatives of the Confederation and tried to explain what had happened. "The Confederation mastered the art of warfare through dominance," he said. "They learned to project military force with perfect efficiency. They learned to conquer territory and population. But they did not understand that warfare is ultimately about imposing will, and that military force is only one tool for doing so. Humans taught them that there is a more fundamental form of warfare, one that operates at the level of meaning and identity rather than force and strategy." "You speak of this as though it were a victory," said one of the Confederation delegates. "It was," replied James, "but not in the way you might expect. We did not defeat the Confederation militarily. We did not overthrow their government or destroy their military. We simply refused to be destroyed. We insisted on being human, even at the cost of our lives. And that refusal transformed the Confederation in ways that military conquest never could have. The Confederation learned from humanity that there is value in things that serve no military purpose, that meaning matters. That identity matters, that the preservation of a species' essential character is worth resources and effort, even if it makes the civilization less efficient. That is not a human victory over the Confederation. That is a gift that humanity gave to the Confederation, and it was given not through force, but through defiance, through art, through culture, through the simple, extraordinary determination to remain human in the face of everything that would make us something else." 100 years after Marcus Halsey's act of defiance, the Confederation was unrecognizable from what it had been before. It remained a unified galactic civilization, but one based on collaboration rather than domination. Military forces still existed, but they were diminished and understood to be a tool of last resort rather than the foundation of civilization. Humans had become central to Confederation culture, not because they were superior, but because they possessed something the Confederation had lacked: the ability to create meaning in a meaningless universe, to find value in things that served no strategic purpose, to insist on the importance of individual lives even when doing so was inefficient. Velkodrin, now ancient even by Quilleth standards, delivered what would be his final address to the Confederation Council before his retirement. He spoke of the evolution of the Confederation and the role that humanity had played in it. "We were masters of war," he said. "We perfected the doctrine of conquest. We developed strategy and tactics that were unassailable. And in doing so, we discovered that we had mastered everything except the one thing that truly matters. We had learned how to destroy our enemies, but we had not learned how to build a civilization worth having. Humans taught us that, not through military action, not through force, but through the simple, persistent refusal to surrender their humanity." One man sang a song in the face of death, and that song changed the galaxy. That is the kind of mastery that lasts. That is the kind of victory that builds rather than destroys. The Confederation was conquered not by human military superiority, but by human identity. And it is better for having been so conquered. We are no longer the masters of war. We are something far better. We are a civilization that understands that there are forms of strength that have nothing to do with weapons or force. The War Council was silent as Velkodrin concluded his remarks.
Even Vecthar, who had opposed the transformation of the Confederation most strongly, seemed to have accepted the fundamental truth. The age of conquest through force had ended. The age of civilization built on meaning and identity had begun. And it had all started with one human, Marcus Halsey, who had simply refused to accept that his life was expendable, who had stood before execution and sung, who had reminded the galaxy that humans, despite their military inferiority, possessed something far more valuable than any weapon. The Confederation would never conquer another species through force. Oh, there would still be conflicts and disputes, but they would be resolved through negotiation and cultural exchange rather than military dominance. And whenever a younger species was tempted to use overwhelming force to crush a weaker opponent, they would remember the story of how a militarily inferior species had transformed the most powerful civilization in the galaxy through the simple refusal to be conquered. Marcus Halsey's daughter, Emma, now in her 60s and a prominent Confederation diplomat, stood at the memorial that had been erected on New Jakarta to commemorate her father's act of defiance. On it was inscribed a simple phrase in human language and Confederation script. Here, one man became humanity, and humanity changed everything. She placed her hand on the stone and thought about what her father had done. He had not won a war. He had not defeated an enemy through military might. He had simply sung. And in singing, he had reminded everyone that humans are more than their utility, that all species are more than their utility, that there is value in meaning, in identity, in the fundamental right to be yourself, even if your utility to the greater civilization is thereby reduced. The Confederation had mastered war, but they had done so by being reminded by an inferior species that mastery of war was not the goal. The goal was to build a civilization where all species could flourish, where all life could be valued not for its strategic utility, but for its inherent worth. And that, ultimately, was the greatest victory of all.